Hi, today we will explain the storyline of the movie titled Derailed, which was released in 2005. Okay, let's get right to the story. Charles is a loving and responsible husband with a harmonious family. Together with his wife Deanna, they have a daughter named Amy and a dog named Bernie. As usual, he starts his day with breakfast with his wife and daughter, who has diabetes. That morning, Charles misses his train and has to wait for the next one, forgetting to buy a ticket. On the train, he stares at a woman and doesn't notice the conductor checking tickets. Since he doesn't have any money, the woman pays for Charles's ticket. Charles promised to repay the woman, who introduced herself as Lucinda and claimed to work at a financial consulting firm. They agreed to meet again on the same train so Charles could repay her, and as promised, they met the next day to properly introduce themselves. Lucinda mentioned that she was married, had a husband, and a daughter named Amber, whom she said was older than Amy. Lucinda also knew Charles's full name from his bag, which had a specially designed lock. Upon arriving at the office, Charles found out the name of the company where Lucinda worked and found her name and brief profile on the company's website. That afternoon, Charles couldn't stop thinking about Lucinda's beauty, so he mustered up the courage to call her and invite her to lunch. The next day, Charles met Lucinda again for lunch while pouring out his concerns about Amy's future. That day, Charles lied to Deanna that he would be coming home late because he had to work overtime at the office. Lucinda did the same. She called her husband to tell him she would be coming home late because of work. That night, the two of them went to a club, where Charles bet that he could kiss Lucinda without touching her lips. He then brought his face close to Lucinda's. But it turned out to be a trick so that Lucinda wouldn't dodge him. In other words, Charles lost the bet, but at least he managed to kiss Lucinda. Suddenly, a drunk man came and disturbed them. The man kept teasing Lucinda until Charles got angry, especially when the man called Lucinda a cheap woman. Charles immediately hit the drunk man, then pulled Lucinda's hand to quickly escape from the club. Here, they seemed to already have feelings for each other. They started hailing a taxi and looking for a hotel to spend the night together. But a moment later, Lucinda looked very anxious. She stopped the taxi and felt she couldn't continue with their plan, and Charles also got out. Charles also realized that what they were doing was wrong, but it was already too late to go home. Nearby, there was a small hotel, and they decided to book a room. Charles asked Lucinda if she still wanted to go home or stay at the hotel with him. Lucinda remained silent, then decided to stay at the hotel. As a result, they continued their plan to sleep together. But suddenly, the sound of a gun being pointed at Lucinda's head was heard. They had no idea that a robber had snuck into their room while they were distracted. The robber immediately hit Charles and demanded that they both hand over their wallets. That wasn't all. The robber was also attracted to Lucinda's beauty and took the opportunity to touch her. Charles saw an opportunity to fight back, but the robber quickly thwarted his attack, causing him to fall and hit the table. In a dazed state, Charles tried to get up, but the robber struck him again with the gun's handle, knocking him unconscious. Lucinda could only follow the robber's orders without anyone to protect her. Sometime later, Charles regained consciousness. By then, the tragic events had already unfolded, but Lucinda sat motionless with a blank expression. Filled with regret and guilt, Charles offered to take Lucinda to the hospital, but she refused. Charles intended to report the incident to the police immediately, yet Lucinda stopped him, fearing their affair would be exposed. In the end, Lucinda decided to end their affair and forget everything that had happened. Charles went to work without returning home, his face still bruised and his nose broken. His boss asked if he was okay, and Charles explained that he had been robbed the night before but was feeling better now. Hearing this, Charles's boss told him to go home and rest. When he arrived home, Deanna was shocked to see her husband's condition. Charles then gave the same excuse he had told his boss. A few moments later, the house phone rang.
So we came here when I was little.
And coincidentally, Charles answered it. It turned out that the robber from the night before had obtained Charles's home phone number. At the same time, his wife also answered the phone in another room because their phone lines were connected in parallel, so Deanna overheard their conversation. Charles interrupted the call and told his wife that it was work-related, then asked her to hang up. This way, the robber knew that Charles hadn't told his wife the truth. He then threatened Charles and demanded a ransom of $20,000 to keep quiet, which Charles immediately agreed to. The next day, before giving the money to the robber, Charles met Lucinda at her office. He told her about the threat and extortion, then urged Lucinda to report the previous night's incident to the police, but she refused because she was too afraid her husband would find out she had been cheating on him. If he found out, he would divorce her, and their daughter would be taken away. Lucinda only gave Charles a small amount of money, hoping it would help ease his burden. Of course, Charles refused Lucinda's offer. After the meeting, Lucinda asked them not to have any further contact. To make a long story short, Charles went to meet the robber at the agreed location, intending to give him the money and hope the matter would be settled. While waiting, another man approached him. It turned out to be the robber's accomplice, who wanted to ensure Charles was safe and not carrying any weapons. After that, he led Charles to an underground room where the robber, called LaRoche, was waiting. Unfortunately, LaRoche wasn't satisfied with just the money. He felt the need to beat Charles for foiling his attempt to break into Charles's credit card. However, a few weeks later, the robber called Charles again. At the time, he was walking home, and he said that this time he wouldn't give the robber a single penny. Charles never expected the robber to call directly from inside his house, so he hurried home. However, Deanna was fine. In fact, LaRoche invited Deanna to chat and socialized with Amy in the living room, claiming to be Charles's work colleague. Deanna then left them to talk. Here, LaRoche demanded $100,000 from Charles. Without hesitation, the cruel robber also threatened to kill his wife and child, so Charles was scared and worried about their fate. In the end, he had no choice but to give him the money. However, before giving it to him, Charles consulted with his lawyer, Jerry. Charles told him everything, but according to Jerry, the case was quite complicated. More than 6 weeks had passed since the incident, and there was no concrete evidence against the robber, such as a medical report. Additionally, if the robber had entered Charles's house without any signs of forced entry, Charles would have no grounds to press charges. However, Jerry mentioned there was one way to help Charles, provided he could convince Lucinda to assist them as a witness. For that, Charles returned to Lucinda's office, told her everything that had happened, and persuaded her to report it to the police. Unfortunately, Lucinda's decision remained the same as before. What was even more shocking was that Lucinda admitted she had recently had an abortion as a result of the rape that night. Lucinda's statement left Charles even more confused and unsure of what to do next. In his confusion, he became extremely frustrated. To clear his mind, Charles confided in an office boy at his workplace named Winston, who was quite close to him. Charles knew Winston had been in prison, so he might be able to help. After Charles told him about all the misfortunes that had befallen him, Winston agreed to help, charging only 10% for his services to resolve Charles's problem and deal with the robber. With no other options, Charles agreed. In short, the two of them went to the meeting place with LaRoche. In the car, Winston showed that he had a gun without bullets to scare the robber. But before he could finish speaking, Winston was shot.
You know what my favorite song is?
LaRoche threatened Charles again and demanded that he prepare the money he had requested. As a result of the incident, Charles had to dispose of Winston's body and car in the river to cover his tracks. The next morning, a detective named Franklin Church visited Charles at his office, and it turned out he was Winston's brother. Franklin informed Charles that Winston had been killed the previous night and his body found in the river. Upon hearing this, Charles pretended to be shocked. Franklin then asked if Charles had a gun, and also wanted to know what Charles had done the previous night. Before Charles could answer, LaRoche called him, saying he had threatened Lucinda at her apartment. He added that if Charles didn't bring the money within 20 minutes, Lucinda would be killed, along with Charles's wife and daughter. Charles rushed to the bank to withdraw his savings, which were actually meant for Amy's medical expenses. However, Charles had no other choice. He didn't want Lucinda and his family to meet the same fate as Winston the night before. After that, Charles went to the apartment where LaRoche and his henchmen were waiting. And sure enough, Lucinda was being threatened with a gun. Without any hesitation, LaRoche demanded the money, and he immediately left with it as soon as Charles handed it over. Charles then asked about Lucinda's condition, assuring her that everything was over and he had given all the money he had. A few weeks later, Charles tried to meet Lucinda again at her office, but Lucinda had deceived Charles. The woman who had been posing as Lucinda Harris was actually a temporary employee named Jane, and according to the receptionist, Jane had left a week earlier. Charles rushed to Lucinda's apartment and received a similar shock. Upon arriving there, he learned that the apartment Lucinda had been living in was rented out monthly. Not only that, Charles discovered the bitter truth that the photo of Lucinda's daughter she had shown was taken from an apartment brochure. Charles then went to the train station, hoping to find Lucinda there. Sure enough, he found her, but she was with a man. Charles quietly followed them, and to his surprise, the man was LaRoche. The two of them looked very affectionate, like a couple. From this, Charles realized that he was the victim of this deceitful couple. Unwilling to be wronged like that, Charles devised a plan to get revenge. He returned to the hotel where he had been robbed and booked a room right next to the one where he had been robbed before. After that, Charles began tailing Lucinda as she was setting up her new victim. Here, Charles realized that Lucinda always arranged for her victims to meet at this hotel because they were working with the hotel staff. Charles hid so he wouldn't be seen by their gang. Then, when they were about to start their scheme, Charles came out of the room and immediately hit LaRoche from behind, knocking him unconscious. Charles then entered the room and caught Lucinda while pointing a gun at her. He explained to the new victim that they were a gang of scammers who wanted to extort him. After the robber regained consciousness, Charles demanded that they return his money. In the midst of the argument, the new victim, who was terrified, tried to grab Charles's gun so he could escape. A shootout ensued, and Lucinda was shot, as were LaRoche and his accomplices. After the commotion subsided, the police arrived at the scene and declared that it was merely a case of adultery and a routine robbery. Charles rushed to the receptionist, showing his ID card with his name on it, to retrieve the bag containing the money he had handed over to the robbers earlier. Thus, Charles successfully recovered his money. The next day, Charles faced a new problem at the office. He was caught taking $10,000 belonging to the company. As a result, he was sentenced to 6 months of community service, teaching inmates in prison. Sometime later, Charles, who was now teaching in prison, saw a notebook containing a story of an affair. He became curious and wanted to read it, and it turned out that the notebook contained his own story. Charles became curious to know who the author was, so he read the entire notebook. After that, Charles was taken to the laundry room. It turned out that LaRoche was still alive. He was imprisoned there and knew that Charles was teaching there. He wanted to avenge the death of his lover, Lucinda. But once again, Charles had planned for LaRoche to be placed where he taught, as he wanted to kill LaRoche with his own hands. In the end, Charles was not punished because he was deemed to have acted in self-defense and had been attacked first by the robber.